On this episode of Skeptiko.
Dr. Martin, what's your goal in this? I hear you talking about engaging video game makers and other culture makers, and I just scratch my head and go, really? Is that where we're going with this? Or you talk about engaging religious leaders. In what way? To kind of tell them they're wrong again?
I think from our standpoint, we've got a lot of data around a very different sort of sense of self than is traditionally researched and is prevalent in society today. A question for us is, how do we get that information out in meaningful ways that are able to significantly impact people's lives? Because it does seem quite beneficial.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on this episode we ask, can you teach enlightenment? I guess the first question we would have to ask really is, what is enlightenment and should we pursue enlightenment? But I think, as you know, if you've listened to this show, that question really kind of answers itself if we take a hard look at this issue of consciousness and we accept the overwhelming evidence that consciousness is something that's real, it's not an illusion, and we further accept the evidence that somehow in some way consciousness seems to survive bodily death. So as soon as we're in that realm, I think we have to start asking these questions of what about this extended consciousness, which I think leads to this idea of enlightenment that so many different wisdom traditions point to. So today's episode, we kind of go one step further and look at someone who's actually researched that consciousness issue. He calls it persistent non-symbolic consciousness, to get around some of the problems associated with words like enlightenment or awakening and those kind of things, which is understandable. If you really dig into this, the words can kind of get in the way. But our guest, Dr. Jeffery Martin, has really tried to step back and take a scientific, analytical approach at what is involved in this process of enlightenment, and has sought to see whether or not he can facilitate the achievement of enlightenment, if that's the right word. I think it's a very interesting topic. I greatly admire his tenacity and his energy that he puts into this research. I hope you enjoy this interview. It's a little bit longer than normal, but we kind of had a lot to talk about. I also have some questions and further thoughts on the interview after it's over, so stick around for that. Here's my interview with Dr. Jeffery Martin. Today we welcome Dr. Jeffery Martin to Skeptiko. Jeffery has a wonderfully varied background, having been a successful entrepreneur, best-selling author, as well as a Harvard-trained academic and researcher of, for lack of a better term, enlightenment. One of the books you might want to check out in connection with this interview is The Fourth Awakening, a book that he co-wrote with Rod Pennington. Jeffery, thanks so much for joining me on Skeptiko. It's certainly great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Let me add one thing to that. I would say my primary and most important training for this came from both Harvard and California Institute of Integral Studies, which are really sort of bookends in my educational process. One brought, a ridiculous amount of sort of quantitative, rigorous thinking, and the other was really, I think, the leading school in the world for qualitative research. And this project could have never been done without, I think, a world-class education in both of those sides of the fence.
Well, that's interesting, and I hope we can get into that a little bit, because I know some of the folks who have been to it's California Institute of Integral Studies, is that right? I can't help but feel that they kind of shy away from that a little bit, or kind of soft pedal it, because it has a certain perception among people, that initial perception. I love the way you just kind of put it out front and contrast it as bookends to one of the most prestigious universities in the world, Harvard, and say, hey, this was amazingly helpful to me in this other way. So right off the bat, that's really cool. Now,
There's a lot of exchange between those institutions as well. I think people probably don't realize. For instance, my very first class at Harvard, the teaching fellow from that class, when he finished with his master's at Harvard, moved to California and got a second master's degree at CIS. And so that sort of exchange, I mean, people might think it's a little unusual, but that sort of thing is not unusual to see, actually.
Well, I think as we get more into your research, there's actually some points of your findings that kind of mirror that in a way, in terms of education level being somehow correlated with what you're finding. But that's maybe tipping our hand too soon here. I have a bunch of questions, 50 questions I'd love to ask you. We won't have time for all of those. I want to jump somewhat into the middle of this. There's a couple of really good interviews with you out there already that people can get some background information. We do want to provide some background information, but we also want to dig into some of the meatier topics with our audience, since we talk on this show so much about consciousness, extended consciousness, big picture science questions. What is the meaning of life? What can science do to help us make decisions about the meaning of life? That I want to kind of accelerate some of this so we can get to some of those questions. But let me start with this idea of non-symbolic consciousness, because I have to say, I think it throws people for a loop right from the beginning, and it even threw me for a little bit of a loop, like, gosh darn, do we really need another term out there to throw in with spiritual awakening or enlightenment or whatever else we're going to do? And then I heard a very nice interview you did for the Buddhist Geeks podcast, in which you explained in a very pragmatic way, which we were talking about just a second ago, why that term was useful in your experiments, in your research. So maybe that's a weird jumping off point, but maybe you want to start with that, this why non-symbolic consciousness?
Sure. In the academic world, I think sometimes you spend years trying to find the right label, and it's based on all of the data you collect and all of that. In our case, it was the exact opposite. We spent like a year or so trying to find a word that would get research subjects, potential research participants, to return our calls. So it was interesting how picky everyone was about their language. Some people would just hang up the phone on you if you used experience instead of consciousness. Some people like consciousness instead of experience. Some people like neither one of them. Enlightenment, non-duality, mystical this, transcendent that. As much as we tried to sort of individually research people and even, look at their books if they had books, or look at their writings and try to match our correspondence to them, still, we would get it wrong, because back in those days, I just didn't have the nuanced understanding, frankly, that I have now. It's almost 10 years later, and I can basically talk to anybody, and they're, really comfortable with me and whatnot. But back then, I didn't know anything. And so our language just really turned people off. And there was this belief that science couldn't study their phenomena. It was funny because that was believed sort of within the academy, and it was believed by the research participants, so we were in an especially friendly spot, as we began trying to do this. So persistent non-symbolic experience basically came from us just trying phrase after word after whatever, just trying to get somebody to call us back and begin to participate in the research and not slam the door in our face because of their sort of presuppositions around what we were and weren't capable of, or did or didn't understand, or could never understand, or whatever else. It came from a line in a Cook-Greuter paper. Suzanne Cook-Greuter got her EDD at Harvard under Keegan, and she did some classifications of an ego development measure and sort of broke out the higher levels of that into a highest level that looks a little bit like enlightenment. And in one of her papers around 2000 or 2001, I can't remember now, it's been too long, she wrote something like non-symbolically mediated consciousness, or something along those lines. And so we looked, really, we were just pulling every word in that we possibly could to throw at the wall, and that one stuck. It was a really happy day when that one worked.
Create a little bit of confusion, creates an opening there. That's interesting. So let's back up a little bit. Jeffrey, tell us more about your background. We alluded to it a little bit there. What would folks want to know about the background of this researcher of enlightenment?
Well, I think maybe the background of the project is, I think you really nailed my background. There's not much more to it than that. I have a long history in media and everything from doing live sporting events to newscasts to every kind of show you can imagine and stuff like that, advertising, you name it.
But a career there, I mean, a legitimate
a whole
career, companies, large
Yeah.
transactions, bigger than most people probably encounter in their professional career in one professional life. So.
Yeah, absolutely. The very last thing that we did there was really reinventing the way television commercials were, in many ways, created and distributed for the world's largest ad agency conglomerate at that time. So yeah, it was an incredible career, frankly, to have so young. And then I went back to a love of mine in computers. Basically, what that resulted in was the media merging with computers, and so you didn't really have, videotape machines or whatever that were going to be the future. And so we were pioneering some of the digital stuff that's basically used today everywhere. And that got me back into computers. And so I wound up back in computers for a little while, building businesses in that space. It coincided with the dot-com booms and busts and all of that stuff. And by my early 30s, really, I just kind of run out of stuff I wanted to do. I had, I think, big goals, but I just met them all. And so I wound up sort of just searching for what I might want to do next. And I don't like to leave things unfinished. And I dropped out of college when I was younger. I was taking college classes on business and television, but that didn't last more than a semester because it was clear to me that everybody that was sitting around me wanted to get a job that I'd had 5 years before that. And so I thought, well, this is kind of silly. First of all, the teachers aren't telling me what's true. I mean, what I'm doing on the weekends for, NBC or somebody is, really different than what these people think is actually going on in that world. So it's not useful knowledge. And so I dropped out. So in my early 30s, when I was just, sort of in a lag, I just really couldn't think of anything else that was really awesome and cool that I wanted to do. I went back to school. And I essentially found a way to test out of the undergraduate levels of education, and then went to grad school and did some testing out there as well. Kind of shortcutted a couple of grad school programs. And then just because of the nature sort of who I am, I just knew that I wanted to finish that process. And so I started to ask myself, what kind of PhD would I like? And after looking at the different things, I realized that my particular belief was that the meat inside of academia was in combining knowledge credibly between multiple disciplines. So I began to look at interdisciplinary programs, and they seem to have a flaw because usually they're usually coming from a single discipline. So like you learn psychology and then you become multidisciplinary, and maybe you reach out to sociology or biology or whatever. That I still felt was a little too one discipline centric. So then I discovered that there was something called transdisciplinarity, which was a kind of a bleeding edge of scholarship. But there was no place to learn it in America that I could find. So I was all set to go to Europe to learn it, where it was basically being pioneered. And then I discovered that CIS had a program in it that was started by an Italian guy. It had a very foreign faculty for the most part. It's kind of a mix of foreigners and Americans. So that was really great because I was thinking my parents are getting older. I don't really want to have to spend like 6 years in England or something. So I wound up taking that program, and that was really fantastic. The idea is basically, how do you do a research project such that your output is credible to all of the different areas of the academy that inform it. So I knew I had to pick something because of the structure of that program. You had to pick something to work on as you went through it. And it was basically, they told us it was basically going to be used in every class. And so it had to be something that wouldn't bore me, 4 or 5 years later, however long it took. And it had to be something that involved tons of different disciplines. And it had to be something that really could be pulled in and used in conjunction with their program. So I really thought about it. And I wound up thinking, it would be interesting to really spend some time looking into mind-matter interaction. I'd just been researching well-being, as I have a huge interest in the psychology of persuasion. And in fact, at the time when I was doing the master's degree work and stuff, one of my master's theses was on was on basically political websites and what motivated people politically. We had a political consulting company at the time, one of my companies, and it did a whole bunch of major work for people, everybody from the far religious right, like the Christian Coalition and people like that were clients, all the way to the left. And so we were really sort of motivating people across the spectrum, and we had the opportunity to do similar messaging and similar websites with famous organizations like the Christian Coalition, and then we could make up organizations essentially. Like we made up an organization called Voices Heard, and we tested how much does the brand really matter in terms of donations and message adoption. I can put out a press release for Christian Coalition, and it's practically read verbatim on the air for Fox. Can I do that for Voices Heard? That type of stuff, right? So I've been doing a lot of stuff around that and around well-being because it paid off to make people feel good about their donations. So we were doing a lot of research around well-being and things like that. And I was my own personal philosophy at the time was one of basically day-to-day well-being and wanting to know what increased my day-to-day well-being. I had a huge disillusioning experience with a lot of religion and philosophy and whatnot early in my life. And so it all sort of I just knitted it all together, basically. So I start this PhD program, and
let me just interject because I think that that's true too, and maybe you want to share with us a little bit because you have on one of the websites, I forget which one I read, but we all weave together our personal, tapestry of events into something that sounds really coherent and nice, and this. But I mean, there were earlier events in your life which we all encounter that, challenged you spiritually, I guess if we're going to use that term,
Sure.
From a faith-based perspective. Was that driving you? Is that the story behind this story? Because you are this successful entrepreneur, but you do get a world weariness that some people don't get. Some people just get, wow, more, I get more money, I get more this, more stuff. But you seem to have this weariness. What was that about, and was that with you from an early age, or is something that just developed?
Well, that's a good question. I was talking not long ago to a friend of mine named Jeff Warren, who wrote a great book called The Head Trip, and he was in a writing retreat working on a later book, and he was revisiting William James's work. And so we were having this conversation about what he was rereading in William James. And at the time, he was really interested in this notion that James had of once born and twice born people. Just to sort of shortcut what that might mean, once born people are, essentially, they're not ever going to be seekers or searchers or whatever else. There's just something about them that they're just okay with the way stuff is. And they go through life and they don't really feel any sort of great churning or emptiness or void of meaning or anything like that, right? And then twice born people are, in their first incarnation, in their first birth, there just seems to be something about them that's just fundamentally uncontent with life. And so maybe it's the huge void of meaning, or it can show up in so many different ways, but they basically need to find something that's like a second birth that gets them to that more content place that the once born people just seem to sort of naturally inhabit. So I was definitely a twice born person, as James would call it. I grew up in a very sort of right-wing Christian environment. My mom was a Christian TV show host with a big syndicated missionary show, for instance, for a while. My aunts and uncles are all sort of in that business, not Christian media necessarily, but they're like, theologians, or they ran master's programs in Christian education and, stuff like that. They're all either teachers or ministers or were, now one's a Christian financial planner, but he was a minister for years. I mean, that kind of stuff.
Makes for interesting Thanksgivings, huh?
Yeah. Well, in my early years, I was in Hong Kong and Europe, and so I wasn't like indoctrinated by the family per se. In my earliest years, my dad was a corporate guy, and so we were going around the world while he was doing his corporate finance stuff or whatever. And so I didn't have a lot of exposure to my mom's family until a little bit later on in life. But nonetheless, obviously my mom instilled that in me and all of that. And I was working, my first jobs were in religious broadcasting. That's how I got into broadcasting. And the chief engineer that volunteered down there was the chief engineer for NBC locally. And so I started working for them before I could even drive, really. That kind of thing. I had to get an exception from the union and all that because I was only 15 and they didn't have anything in their rules about that. I come from that background, but what happened was around 16 or 17, my parents started to think about getting divorced. And my mom was, I guess, feeling comfortable enough to do it, but probably shouldn't have, to share that with her circle at the TV studio and all of that. And they just immediately dropped the show, pulled it from the air worldwide. I was invited not to come back to my Christian school for senior year of high school, things like that. So that was a huge ripping away of my belief system. But having said that, I was not necessarily the guy that you would want in that Christian school anyway, because I had a bunch of uncles who were theologians, right, and or theologian types who are deep thinkers in these areas. And I had a lot of questions, and I was twice born, not a once born, right from the cradle. And so I was constantly, I'm sure, the annoying kid in class I have a reasonably good intellect, right? So that's problematic for you as well in those situations if you're a teacher, right? So it's not that I necessarily blame them in hindsight. I probably was somewhat, disruptive to them trying to indoctrinate the other children to not think about things. But that nonetheless was a very painful period. I think it's amazing, actually, I didn't kill myself during that period because it was just such a deep ripping away. And actually, those chief engineers at that Christian TV station really were the ones that saved me. And so that really led to a period of years, over a decade after that, where I looked through every religion, I looked through every philosophy, every spiritual system, you name it. And I was really just looking for one thing. I was looking for something that when I looked at the adherents, they seemed to do the same thing that their religion or their dogma or their philosophy or whatever it is said they should be doing.
That's interesting, Jeffrey. What do you think is behind that? Do a little quick pop psychology on yourself. Why were you looking for adherence, coherence? Because you still saw those, you assumed there was legitimacy to these structures, these institutions. So you just wanted to see people who could toe the line, I guess, right? Is that, or what was it?
Right. Well, I felt like I'd really seen the top of the Christian world. I was working at a major studio on the Bible Belt, so I knew everybody who was a famous minister for the most part, at least in our portion of it, not like there's different sects in Christianity, right? We were like the conservative group. It wasn't like Joel Osteen and the prosperity gospel people and all that. It was like the more hardcore, really seriously into the Bible type people. And, they'd all been through my life at some point. And so, and I knew the people around them. And I knew what that world professed a Christian should be like. And when I saw what resulted, me not being invited back to the Christian high school, my mom's show being pulled from the air worldwide almost instantly, it just didn't seem in any way congruent with what they talk about in terms of what a Christian should be like. And so that really was my wake-up call, because I realized that I just believed something that was false for all of those years. There was just this belief that they put out there that this is what Christianity did for you inside you, right? That it just created a certain type of person. That, okay, there was struggle with it, and we had struggles, but here were really, the levers of power within that world, within, I would argue, the part of that world that exemplified it the most, that tried to be the most hardcore and strict and accurate.
You became interested in the fruit of this quest, and you didn't see it in the Christian tradition. That's an awesome maybe lead in. Let's tell folks a little bit about, we've been talking around it, about this research that you do. Let's give them the who, what, where, why, when. First of all, what is this body of research? What is it about? We said it's about enlightenment. We said it's about all those words associated with it. For the average person, how would they understand what your research question is?
Well, my original question was really, who are the happiest people? And, is there anything special about them? What makes them the happiest people? And so that's really where I was digging back in the day.
And other interesting point that I want you to speak about is you had this psychology sensibility from the positive psychology movement, and you were also looking at kind of the self-help prosperity movement and all that. What were some of your ideas going in? I found that very interesting. Some of your ideas going in terms of how those were supposed to fit together and how they might lead to an answer to this question about well-being, sense of happiness.
Yeah, that's actually kind of a funny story, really, how I even got here, because I'd left all these notions behind in my early 20s, really, early mid-20s. And I was interested in day-to-day well-being. It just seemed to me that no religion, no spiritual system, that nothing that I found really seemed to do what it promised in terms of, making people happier. At least it didn't work for me. And so I was just, focused on day-to-day well-being and yesterday better than yesterday, or at least as good as yesterday, and that type of thing. That really sort of became my philosophy. It became the only thing that I felt that I could really know on a day-to-day basis is where my well-being was. So by the end of the early 2000s, I guess by the middle of the 2000s, I'm researching that question, as deeply, really, as I have over the preceding 20 years or so. But it's, I've picked up a lot of academic research expertise that I didn't have before. I've gone back to school, I've picked up a couple of master's degrees or whatever. I understand research in a new way. And so I feel like I'm able to even do a better job than I was able to do before that of clearing away the crap and not sort of self-deluding myself or, not having biases be introduced or whatever. And so I was really experimenting with those techniques and stuff that I was learning, trying to refine this all even more for myself. Because, I just felt like I was so self-deluded back then that it's a really important thing to me that I try to be as not deluded, right?
So what would be, give people a sense of what would be some of those techniques coming out of psychology, cognitive psychology, positive psychology? What was the stuff there?
Back then it was, it was actually mostly the psychology business research, because those degrees were in technology and business. And so it was the type of research that they teach you in the academic world around how to do business type research, which is really great stuff because, it's product focus groups. Nobody wants to spend millions of dollars on advertising and have it be misspent, right? So they really care a lot about whether or not they're getting accurate answers and whether they're really drilling down to the good stuff and all of that. And so I was using those types of techniques. So it's your kind of your standard qualitative type group work, right? So at the time I was pulling together groups of people, and it occurred to me that there were this whole world out there of these self-help methods that people were spending billions of dollars on. In a way, the world was like a living laboratory, but nobody was really researching them. I contacted the major self-help authors and stuff, and it's pretty clear that they didn't want their stuff researched. And so I was sort of on my own with that. And so we created a taxonomy, and we categorized it all, and then we tried to look at what was the most popular stuff in each one of the categories. And then we put together small groups, and we had people try those methods. And sometimes they were goal-oriented, sometimes not. It depended upon the method and what it advocated and stuff like that. So if it was goal-oriented, then we would have them pick certain goals, and we would look at the goals and make sure that they weren't like ridiculous, like, I want to colonize space or something that wasn't going to happen in the next 3 months. And so we tried to keep everything to something that was a stretch, but something that was not out of the realm of possibility for achievement. And, I really don't talk much about this research anymore, so it's kind of fun to go back to it a little bit. But what we basically found was that for each one of those methods, it would work for a very small percentage of people. It would not work for most people. And for some people, it would be kind of disastrous. And ironically, we found sort of that same pattern years later with things like certain types of meditation. So when we were in the last couple of years, when we sorted through the qualitative data, most of the project has had kind of a neuroscience bent. We really felt like it was about looking at brain regions and affecting those brain regions with neurofeedback and neurostimulation and stuff like that. But we're a ways away from being able to really do that. We've worked our way through all of the current technologies for that, and they're just not good enough yet. And so we're probably like waiting 5 years or so until algorithms catch up and, certain brain stimulation type techniques, technologies, and stuff catch up. So we've gone back and we've been looking at the qualitative stuff that people said. And one of the interesting things around that was that it seemed like only a handful of categories of methods rose to the top for people that were trying to get to these states. Now, let me back up a little bit. It's getting ahead of ourselves. Let me back up and answer some of your questions.
But let me interject, because there's some parallels there between, I think it really, I love going back and talking about your old research, because I think it's important, and I think there's parallels with your current research. One of the things that I noticed in hearing about your old research was exactly what you just described. You saw that different techniques were effective for people, and eventually you came to the conclusion that it was somewhat of a developmental matching thing, a mismatch. So if someone was at a certain stage of, I guess, maybe ego development or personality development, however you want to say that, there might be some techniques that were a good fit for them, and then those same techniques would be, like you just said, disastrous for other people. And you just hinted that you found some real parallels in this seeking for spiritual enlightenment, awakening, and all that, that also matches that. And I think that rings true for all of us. We've all encountered those people that have seen what someone else has achieved, tried to replicate it in their life, and it just doesn't work, or like you say, it has really negative consequences. And we've seen that. I mean, one of the reasons I guess I'm drawn to that is, in my personal professional career, it somewhat mirrors yours in that, I had an MBA and I was working towards my PhD. I started a business and I was totally unsuccessful because I was following these ideas that I'd learned in school. And I decided to go back to school with self-help. So I started reading all these business. I was like a maniac. I was just listening to tapes all the time on every possible range of self-help thing. But I found them very useful. I would always find one little morsel there that I could use. And I think that my experience is not too different from other people's experience, particularly in business. Successful people will point to things and say, hey, that works. It might work for you. It might not, but I've seen it work for this many people. So I think a lot of entrepreneurial people have a sense for the underlying truth to what you're pointing to, that there are some different techniques that work, but they don't work all the time, and they don't work on different people. And then it's interesting that you've taken that and you've found that also to be true in this other dimension too. So it's fascinating.
It's amazing how ignorant I was basically when I started both of these research tracks, because these notions of continuum, of there being sort of this continuum where you could place people with a degree of accuracy and then give them methods that would basically be a fit for them and that would make a difference for them and all of that. In both cases, that just emerged from the data. Like I thought when we were researching the persistent non-symbolic stuff, that there was just going to be like a state, some sort of ongoing state of persistent non-symbolic experience. And I kind of, in the academic world, there's this notion of common core, which means that like there's a common core underneath all of these different mystical traditions or whatever else. And I just kind of thought, well, that makes sense. They all kind of sound alike, and probably we'll find that there's just like this thing, and our goal is to really just get down to what the commonality is among all of these different people and their reports and stuff. And so in the same way that the data emerged from these focus groups, if you will, or these research groups with the former research, and then there wound up being a continuum, and people wound up moving as they developed, and a method would stop working for them and they'd need a new method, and you could just start to put stuff in order over time with the old research. The same thing kind of happened with the enlightenment stuff, if we want to call it that, or with the persistent non-symbolic stuff, and that it started to become clear that there were clusters of people that, there was something that was sort of fundamentally different across all of them. They'd all had a very significant shift in their sense of self, in their sense of who they are and how the world showed up for them and stuff. But there was nuance in that you just couldn't write off. And you just kind of couldn't stick them in one big bucket, It was obvious that there were these different buckets, if you will.
Dr. Martin, let's go back for a second and talk about methodology a little bit, because I know a lot of listeners to this show are pretty savvy about research and research methods, and I think they'd find a lot of interest in what you're doing. So you go out and your goal is to seek these people. First, tell folks that you subjected them to just a barrage of psychological metrics in every way that you could do testing, every way that you could do it. And then that leads eventually to these lengthy interviews that you do. So who are the subjects? How do you find them? How are you measuring what you measure? That kind of stuff.
Right. I don't think it's worth producing research that isn't believable by people, or that they're not going to find credible, or that you can't get disseminated, or that isn't going to help anyone or whatever. And so the very first thing that we did when we realized that this was one of the groups that might have the most well-being, and that it was one of the directions that we were going to look in, because in the early days it wasn't the only one. It sort of became our focus over time as the other groups fell away as less interesting. I knew that there were, obviously you just know inside the academy that there's a problem when you go to try to research something like this, right? There's just a total bias against it. People are making anti-materialist claims, which is a huge problem in the first place, and it deals with religion, which, is like shunted off into its own corner of the academy and all of that. And so the first thing that we did was we really spent some time talking to senior people in the academic psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience research fields, and asking them, how can we even do this in a way that, just doesn't totally get written off? And what they said was, they talked to us about two things, and pretty much everybody said the same thing. They talked to us about two things. The first was the types of people that we needed to pick for our initial sample, and how we needed to think about that. And the second was the way that we should go about trying to collect data on them. And so their advice initially was, you need to pick people who are from very well-established traditions, and who are in communities, and who are supported by those communities, who basically, so in other words, there's a set of rules that says, there's A, B, C, D, and E. If you check off A, B, C, D, and E, then you are X in this tradition, right? And then there have to be a group of people, a substantial group of people, who all just sort of uniformly agree, yes, that person is X. They have checked off A, B, C, D, E. So they wanted sort of that kind of, which I thought was brilliant. It was really useful. I was thinking to myself, well, we'll probably like find 5 people that'll be true for, or whatever, at the very beginning, right? Because there's a lot of lore around this and around how rare it is and stuff, but that didn't turn out to be true. So we started by approaching sort of people like that. And, these were very busy people. They were often famous people, and at least in their own religious traditions or whatever. And so they were pretty hard to get to. But we did get time with enough of them in those early days and whatnot to realize that, okay, so anyway, so we started there, and then we widened it out to like religious orders and stuff. There are a few libraries that collect publications from like off-the-grid nunneries and things like that. And so we went and made copies of all the contact information and sent them things telling them what we were doing, telling them what we were looking for, A, B, C, D, E, and then a community that says, okay, they're X, all that. And so that's really where our early subjects came from, was that process. And as you correctly note, the other piece of advice was you need to give them gold standard measures. You need to send them they're going to be all over the world, so you're not going to be able to pull them into a lab or something, right? So you should just start by getting your arms around the population by sending them these gold standard measures. And so, psychopathology measures, personality measures, developmental measures, just all the different little areas of psychology and research in psychology, they all have, things that are used by tons of people. Like in anxiety, there's a measure called STAI. And it's just been used in zillions of articles. And so it's considered, a really well-known kind of gold standard academic measure for anxiety. And so we would pick measures like that for things that we were interested in, and we would send them out to the research subjects who agreed to do this in batches. And we would basically just keep sending them batches of research measures until they said, listen, I'm never filling out anything ever again. I mean, to be frank, we just went for it. Because we had no idea what we were looking for, right? We were just trying to get our arms around this population of people that seemed to talk about the world totally different than everybody else. And what was really disappointing to us is that, and we continue using measures to today. We have ongoing experiments right now that we're using all kinds of measures in. So don't be too disheartened by what I'm about to say. But it was very disheartening at the time when we got the measures back and we scored them. They really didn't show anything. They just showed that people they had high well-being for the most part. They had no, little or no depression, anxiety, stress, things like that. There were problems with the measures. I now know, for instance, that we use a major measure called the CESD for depression. And there are some questions in there that if you're experiencing persistent non-symbolic experience, you're going to answer a certain way, but not because you're depressed. Just because how you experience the world is different than how ordinary people who are depressed, So there's some mismatches. We've learned a lot about mismatches in these things and what questions can kind of be thrown out and ignored and stuff like that over time. So that was really disappointing, right? Because we've been through a lot of time and effort to get those surveys out to people, to get those measures out to people, and then we get them back and it just basically doesn't really show anything that's that meaningful. At least that was my view. It didn't seem to be that meaningful.
But I think the process, as you're saying, the process is important, and I love the way you've gone through that, and I think folks can get a sense for the openness that you had, which is really impressive. You were really grappling with this without a lot of preconceived notions, it sounds like. At least you were disciplining yourself to try and do that, which is great. And then this gives way to some of your later research, which I think we also need to highlight this fact, that later on you decided that you really needed to engage with these people with these long, lengthy sessions. 12-hour interviews. What was that all about, and what led to that in your research?
It's a familiar pattern, right? So in the same way that we would send measures out until somebody told us they never wanted to fill out another question, we would basically sit in their living room until they threw us out because they had to go to sleep or something. Or we would close restaurants and then coffee shops and the latest night place in town, and then talk in the parking lot, of there for a while before finally going, that kind of thing. So yeah, it came from just not getting anything meaningful from all of that survey stuff. So I went back to sort of the people who had been advising us, that were this sort of scions within the academy that we turned to initially for advice, and said, well, this is where it got us. They weren't nearly as disappointed in the academic measures as I was, and I can understand why now. I'm a very different academic than I would have been back then. I was a lot greener, so now I see the value in all of that work. But at the time, I was just really disappointed. So they were like, well, it doesn't sound like you're going to get much from this. You can either pull them into one place and take your best guess on attention experiments and stuff like that. Or you can enter a qualitative phase where you're just going out and you're just doing a lot of deep exploratory interviewing, trying to see, if you can get anything out of that.
Okay, so just let's back up and make sure we're not passing over something that inside baseball is what I always say. We're not talking too much inside baseball. So the subjects you're talking to at this point are people who have both self-identified and been identified within their religious community, let's say a Zen group. They've said, hey, these three guys, they got it. What you're talking about of this enlightenment, this non-duality, yeah, they are it. They can do what you're talking about. Those are the people you should talk to. So you have these different pockets of groups of people that meet these basic criteria that you're looking for, and now you barrage them with these psychology tests, and now you're interviewing them for the purpose of what? What is, you're interviewing them about their thinking, about their mental, not their mental functioning, but their mental experience, right? So
it's funny because the way we interviewed them wound up being an accidental necessity. And that was really the thing that I think was the reason that our project has been so successful. So I first sat down with them, right? And when you sit down with people in different religious traditions, I mean, they're talking about their own iconography and dogma and ideology and all that. And so, like if you're sitting down with a Buddhist of a certain sect and a certain faction, even within a sect, they may be talking about spaciousness and the importance of spaciousness, and maybe they can go on for hours about spaciousness, right? You're sitting down with a Christian person, they might be talking about, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit or whatever their particular Christian sect is into. And it doesn't take very long to realize that that's just not useful, right? Like, unless you're actually having that experience, there's no real way to create an analog to that, like in the brain or, and so what came out of that was basically an interview, a kind of a semi-structured interview a semi-structured interview format that basically went like this, to just skip ahead a little bit for time reasons. You sit down with somebody, give them a half an hour or an hour to just talk about that in their own words as much as they want to. Right? But knowing that mostly you're just kind of letting them get it out of their system, getting a little bit of synchronization on language, getting a little bit of history and jumping off points on things like that. But mostly what they're saying is not stuff that's going to actually be that useful in terms of correlative data and things like that. So then going into I started, just accidentally stumbling into it, really. I was just in the same, just like with non-symbolic, just like the word non-symbolic, just trying a bunch of stuff, trying to make some progress. Eventually, I hit upon the notion of asking them questions around kind of a cognitive science framework. And so, I asked them about changes in their thoughts and thinking, because they seem to talk about their mind quieting down or all thoughts going away or whatever else. So that seemed like an obvious place to dig into. They would talk about changes in emotion, a variety of changes in emotion. So I started just sort of rigorously asking them questions around cognition, affect, emotion, basically. Cognition is thoughts and thinking. Affect is emotion, among other things. Perception and memory, which really are kind of the heart of cognitive science. And so I wound up with kind of this very comprehensive, deep digging effort into them from a cognitive science perspective, which I realized pretty early on was getting answers that I could imagine, okay, well, that seems to relate to, like, it could be this part of the brain, or, so I felt like we were on a good track also for however many years it took to get to where people could be scanned in fMRI machines, or you could do EEG work with them or whatever else. Most neuroscience projects are really long. I mean, there's like 5 years of this type of data collection. It's not uncommon for there to be just years of data collection like this before you put anybody in a scanner. And so I was totally comfortable being in that phase. I knew about that type of pattern in that research area for really novel research like this. So I felt like, okay, well, we're in that data collection phase. And so that was really how our particular interview method and how our particular interview style adopted. We basically did things in the same order. So I would almost always ask about cognition first, and then I would ask about memory, and then I would ask about emotion, and then I would ask about perception, and then I would ask about memory. And I would weave back and forth after the first set of questions in each one of those, and just try to deepen and clarify and make sure that I understood things. And one of the fascinating things about this was that even when we were sitting down with people who had thousands of students or tens of thousands of students or whatever, or devotees or parishioners or whatever term is appropriate for their thing, I was asking them questions that they'd never thought about before. The minute I got to these cognitive science questions, I asked them a question, and they would just kind of sit there quietly. And in the early years, I thought, wow, they're really deeper reflective, and they're just, but the reality is that they were just sort of like searching for like, well, God, how do I answer that? So all of the billions of questions that they'd had, like nobody had ever asked them this stuff. And that wound up being another bit of our secret sauce, because there was basically no way to fool us. There wasn't a book that you can go and read these answers in. And so, unless Carmelite nuns were somehow coordinating their answers with Tibetan Buddhists, our data that emerged from these organically from these interviews and from these people basically searching their lived experience while they were sitting there with us, trying to answer these questions, which I think was a very challenging experience for them, but also a very rewarding experience. Many of them said, this was fantastic, and that's I think why we got away with sitting with them for so many hours, because they'd never really had anybody dig into this, and they're interested in their own sort of cognition and their own processes, and there was this value that they got from it. By being forced to explore it in this new way that they, after all these years and after all those zillions of questions, had never explored it in.
Mm-hmm. And let me just interject, because we've talked about brain science a little bit and neuroscience, and I think it's important, especially to people who listen to Skeptiko regularly, and we kind of bash reductionistic, materialistic, non-understanding of consciousness, which is just bizarre, but you are not married to mind equals brain consciousness. What I heard you say that I thought was really brilliant in this pragmatic way that we're talking about is that you don't have to take sides in the consciousness issue of whether consciousness is primary. You can just step back and say, well, clearly conscious is mediated by our neurosystem that we can measure in this way, so we'll start there. And even if we are kind of leaning the ladder against the wrong wall, we can climb this ladder and then maybe find a place to jump off or whatever. But we can only climb this ladder. It's the only ladder we have, because the only thing we can measure is our neurology, right? So you're not married to mind equals brain. It has to reduce down to consciousness is an epiphenomenal brain, an emergent property, any of that stuff. You don't have to take a stake in any of that.
No, I don't think we have any idea what any of this is.
Right. Okay, so here we got to get to the payoff here, the finding, the big picture answer. The New York Times headline for your research finding is what? What does it read?
Well, boy, there are so many of them. That's a good question. That this is certainly a real and I think legitimate phenomenon that people experience. This is, a way that you can experience life. It seems to be an incredibly beneficial way to experience life. There isn't one uniform way that it shows up. And we use the word location instead of levels associated with this, because we don't even want to make value judgments around, one way of experiencing this being better than another way of experiencing this. There's a practicality that's emerged in recent years to this. As an example, most religious traditions and stuff like that, they do have ladders around this stuff, and you can see within most of their frameworks fit. I'm not really aware of any that don't fit within our overall structure. And they're often trying to go from what we would consider one location to another location. Like if you're a Christian, for instance, you might be interested in, you might consider location 2 the first legitimate, persistent mystical experience. And
quickly go over this idea of location and what are the locations that you would talk about. And also let me add I'm going to interject my New York Times headline, and then we'll see what you think of it. Less thinking about thinking leads to a greater sense of well-being. I mean, that's what I think you're after, is how do these people get a greater sense of well-being? And what you found is that less thinking about thinking, it's very general, but that's it. So, but in that you found these different dimensions or locations.
Sure. Yeah, so that's a good place to start. We can start with the cognition, the changes in cognition. So just to keep it simple, we'll say location 1, location 2, location 3, location 4. You can picture them on like a number line from left to right. And there's beyond location 4. There's other stuff beyond that. So location 1, from a cognition standpoint, your mind does, for most people, get a lot more quiet. Now, there's a tiny percentage of people that their mind doesn't get more quiet, that their thoughts actually increase. And for those people, that sounds like a little counterintuitive, except that they're not attached to those thoughts in any way. It's sort of like right now as I sit here, there's a road outside and I can hear a car go by occasionally, but I'm not paying attention to that car. But the car's still there. I'm still driving by, but it's not affecting my conversation with you. I'm not saying, oh, hold on, there's a car. Right? And so in location one, generally speaking, what happens with people is their self-referential thinking begins to diminish. So it's not all thought, right? I mean, they're still able to dress themselves. They still have their favorite foods. I mean, all of that. They're still able to do math problems. They're still able to go to work and, perform their jobs and all of that kind of stuff. But, when they're thinking about what they're going to wear, so when they're dressing themselves in the morning, they're not thinking about, okay, well, gosh, let's see, I'm going to see Jane today. I don't think Jane likes red shirts. She might not like me as well if I wear a red shirt. I really like Jane. I really want Jane to like me. Jane's liking me is really the most important thing in my world. So I'm going to wear a blue shirt. Oh no, wait a minute. No. Jessica's going to be there too. Jessica doesn't really like blue. And one of them doesn't like T-shirts, right? And so there isn't like this mental self-torture around approval. Essentially, there's all this self-referential thought that's going on all the time in our heads, and it turns out that when you get rid of that, you feel a lot more space. You feel a lot more emptiness. You feel a lot of these sort of words that you hear, and they show up in different ways, and there's a lot of complexity to that. I don't want to simplify that. But from a change in cognition standpoint, what happens from location 1 to location 2 to location 3 to location 4 is an increase in diminishing of that. Right, so the process really begins in location 1. It deepens in location 2, where you have less self-referential thoughts than location 1. Then in location 3, less self-referential thoughts than location 2. And then by the time you're to location 4, it's very rare to even have self-referential thoughts if you're sort of deep into location 4. Emotion is another big change. So you have emotion falling off much more rapidly, especially negative emotion in location 1. So somebody might cut you off in traffic, and you're generally speaking, no longer chasing them down for 3 or 4 miles, until they finally pull over at a Quickie Mart or whatever, and you can get out and give them a piece of your mind. That level of sort of craziness where you just, emotion just drags you on this ride, just doesn't seem to happen. So that anger,
positive emotions too, which is very uncomfortable for a lot of folks to contemplate and think about. Not feeling a sense of connection with their spouse, not feeling a love and sense of connection with their kids, or maybe not feeling it but not clinging to it or feeling attached to it. Again, we throw in these words that are packed with some kind of religious meaning, but you got to address that. I think that's something that people find very unsettling. That's
true. I would say that's as we go down the continuum. So in location 1, really, you have mostly this phenomena around negative emotion, really what you would consider the emotions that you'd prefer not to be experiencing that much. Now, it's not that the thoughts and the emotions can't still grab you, right? I mean, somebody cuts you off, you may still flip them off and swear at them or whatever. But it's, 5 minutes from then, you're not going to still be obsessing about it, and you're not going to have the thoughts in your head about, oh, that guy could have killed me. I can't believe he cut me off like that. And, what if there was a baby? What if I had my young son in the car? And that would have been horrible. And, it's just none of that, right? I mean, it's just gone. The event came, it went, you reacted to it, fine. However you reacted, whatever your conditioning did or whatever your personality did, fine. It reacted how it reacted, but then it fell away. So in location 2, more of the negative, you basically have an increasing shift from negative to positive emotion. The negative emotions are falling away, and your experience is primarily of positive emotion. And as you deepen into that, you get to the end of that where it's primarily positive emotions that you're experiencing. And then a shift into location 3 brings quite a change in emotion. It's very much like you hear about this a lot in various, especially Abrahamic type traditions, where there's this union with God notion, union with the divine, that type of thing. And people talk about there being this one underlying emotion or sense that's kind of a combination of love and joy, just impersonal love, divine love or impersonal love or whatever. Joy, sometimes sort of a sense of everything sort of being consciousness, compassion. All of these words are a little bit loaded because what they mean and how they show up is different depending on which one of these locations you're in. But there's this one sort of emotion that has these different facets to it that seems to be with people virtually all the time in that location. And then in location 4, so if you kind of think of location 3 as sort of maximum positive emotion in a way, right? It's as good as sort of positive emotion could get. And then in location 4, that falls away, and you have an absence of emotion. And this is where what you're talking about becomes kind of disturbing for people, because I remember so many stories about people talking about their children, and how weird it was to not feel parental love anymore, and they just literally don't feel love. Love's gone, right? Love is one of those emotions that's gone. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to kind of make a distinction between emotion and feeling. Emotions seem to be sort of these constructed entities, and there's a lot of interesting work that's been done around that in the psychology world. Whereas you can still have basic feelings, right? Like if you see a rattlesnake, you can still be alerted to it. You can still have a brief fear response to it. You can have agitation, things like that come up, but that's fundamentally different than the way most of humanity would think about or talk about fear or agitation or whatever. It's almost like just sort of your core innate physiological wiring responses that just pop up very, very briefly, as opposed to things that you're richly invested in and that stick around and last for a while and all of that. So anyway, love, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to be one of those things that is like a fear. That is like there is no brief love response like there's a brief fear response if a rattlesnake crosses your path or something like that. So a lot of emotion that we sort of have been socially conditioned to value and whatnot does actually go away. And so then there's changes in perception. There's memory effects to round out those 4 categories. But I think that gives you sort of a gist of what changes over those 4.
Oh yeah, and there's a lot to dive in there, and I don't know if we'll get to it all, but let's try to. Let's jump over and now talk about the meaning issues, because I think that's where people are really at. What does this mean? And I guess the first place to start is, what does this mean for you? How has this changed you? It obviously, despite this nice wrapped up academic professionalism that you add to it, which is extraordinarily polished, this is also a personal thing for you. I mean, what has it meant for you, personal transformation, spiritually wise?
It's interesting. I was at a point in my life by the time I looked at this that it wasn't in any way something that I was really interested in or seeking. And so it provided me with, I was pretty happy with my day-to-day philosophy of well-being. And I'd, been beaten up so badly early in my life trying to find a counter to that I wasn't interested in finding a counter to it. So this really was, an investigation of this from a sort of a day-to-day well-being perspective. Okay, well, these people seem to be the ones that claim the most well-being. Let's find out if that's true and what's different about them and what maybe we could take from them or learn from them. So that was my personal interest in it. It wasn't a spiritual interest or religious or deep meaning or deep truth.
No, I hear you, but did it lead to any changes?
One of the things that I would notice when I would first sit down with people is that some of the people, this is in the interview phase, sometimes after like 10 or 15 minutes, my mind would just be empty. Like I couldn't come up with another question. And so it was pretty clear to me that there was something strange going on there, that there was an effect that being in their presence seemed to have on me. And it could also happen on the phone and whatnot. I did all the interviews in person. But, you would sometimes be setting up the interviews on the phone beforehand, and sometimes it would even happen on the phone while trying to get directions to their place or something crazy like that, right, which is also not helpful. So I learned, this is kind of, I'm sure, like what nobody else would probably do this, I don't know. But I learned to block that. I learned to block the effects, basically, that people had. I learned to force my mind back in front of whatever that strange effect was that they were having on me. And one of the things that I did that, first of all, because I couldn't have asked questions without it, but I kept doing it because right from the very beginning in the interviews, it just so happened that the first few interviews were with people in very different traditions. And yet they were very dogmatic about their own traditions, right? And so they were kind of making these claims of universal and divine truth, if you will. And yet obviously their divine truths conflicted. And so
So just add a little bit of detail there. So you were talking to a Zen Buddhist monk, for example, as well as a Christian mystic kind of thing. So this is two worlds that theologically don't mix, but yet, and they're both saying, yeah, I found it. I went plumbed the depths, and here it is. Here's the truth. And you're like, yeah, I've heard that 10 times already on the road, right?
Right, exactly. And so the interesting thing was that, what that told me is that, okay, well, there probably isn't such a thing as divine truth. There's obvious, and further, there's a lot of dangerous bias. I felt at that time that there was a lot of sort of dangerous bias for me as a researcher that could come into the research process if I were to actually be experiencing what they were experiencing. Because it seemed at the time to lock in some sort of dogmatic worldview. And obviously, there's no way to collect data, in an objective way. You can never do it in an objective way. I mean, we all have our own nervous systems and whatnot, but it's in a maximally objective way for whatever we're capable of as an individual researcher, and be in that state. So it was very clear to me that no matter what happened, I had to avoid that, and I did. I avoided it for many, many years until primary data collection had ended. I avoided it until, even though along the way it became very clear to me that you'd be insane not to want to experience it. I mean, that was obviously the way to live life, right? But I was still resisting it because I just felt like there was no way to do accurate data collection and data analysis from their side of the fence. So eventually I reached a point where the main data collection wound down, where enough other people were going with enough other projects at other places in the academy that really I felt like I could kind of get hit by a bus and the whole thing would still keep going, and or so that if I did have some sort of extremely dogmatic reaction to it, the rest of that community could just kind of get together and say, okay, Jeffrey's lost it, let's just ignore him from now on, and it would all be fine. It wouldn't hurt the overall research effort or anything like that. And so once I felt like I sort of comfortably reached that point, then I started taking down some of those defenses. But also making sure that the researchers that dealt with me and that the researchers that were around me were aware of that, so that they could spot and point out biases that were becoming, should any bias or whatever become clear to them or whatever. I of course have this loop in my head where I'm constantly looking for those types of biases as well, but that doesn't mean anything, that can help you so far, but you really do need other people to help you to get over them or point them out or whatever else. And so that's basically the way that I've approached it.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about, I want to say the counter evidence, but it's not necessarily counter evidence. It's just other stuff that's out there that we might want to harmonize with your research. Let me just kind of lay a couple of these out there in no particular order. I'll start with someone who I interviewed, has written a couple books about her spontaneous transformation, Kundalini experience, a woman from the UK named Hazel Courtney. And it's quite extreme what she experienced and hard to believe, and yet she has some certain credibility as a London Times reporter and all that. But the issue is really spontaneous transformation, and I'm sure you've run across this. How does this fit with your research? People who are maybe just are either doing some kind of practice, like some kind of yogic practice, and have a spontaneous Kundalini experience. Sometimes it really sends them for a loop, drives them crazy for a little while, but they've achieved that, or they can't stabilize it, or they do. So enough on that. You get the idea. Spontaneous transformation. How does that fit?
Well, that's a good time to probably bring up how people transition to this in the first place. About 70% of people in our overall sample had some sort of instant shift. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't continue to deepen and grow and change and whatnot, but they had some sort of fundamental shift where it was clear, like a minute before that or a moment before that, they weren't experiencing anything that sounded like persistent non-symbolic experience, and now they're checking all the boxes, right? So it appears that, now I have to be very careful around our population data right? Because it is basically a snowball sample. It started with those religious people that had communities and stuff, and then we had enough data from them after early interviews to go on to less community-supported spiritual and religious type people. And all of the data was still remaining, consistent enough that we felt like, okay, well, now we can reach out to just ordinary people. So we wrote like a fiction book called The Fourth Awakening, which wound up selling hundreds of thousands of copies and becoming this book that was like the top of his Amazon category for 4 years or whatever. And that was a blessing, because the only reason we really wrote that book was to find research subjects. The idea was, if you put out a book that people will read fiction-wise, and it's a topic they're interested in, and they see one of the authors researches this, maybe they'll get in touch. And so that was great. We got a lot of fantastic research subjects from that. And it allowed us to, and so we did a lot of stuff in that period. I gave a lot of talks and things like that, where we tried to really reach out to the broader population, right? I was curious, like, what's some guy that's gone to, it's a janitor at the local school or whatever that's experiencing this. How's this in his life? I wasn't that interested anymore in the spiritual teachers or the religious leaders or any of that. I got how it showed up for them. By that point, I was much more interested in finding people who were just hiding out there in the population. And we reached a point where we think that there's about 0.5% of the population of Western developed countries that experience this. But as a result of this, our sample is snowballed, right? And so I can't say, so when I say like 70% of people on our sample had an instant shift to this, that may mean nothing, right? I mean, maybe our sample is so heavily skewed that somehow we just found all of them, and there isn't another one on Earth. It's not like we have some representative sample in the population, because there's no good way to do that right now. So I have to sort of caveat that. People always want percentage statistics around, well, how many of this and how many of that, but until you reach a point where this is some well-known phenomenon, you can actually do like Gallup-style population sampling or something. We're never going to get that. So in our sample, at least, 70% of people had an instant transition, if you will. Just in a moment it happened for them. 30% of people had some sort of gradual transition. Sometimes it was over a period of a couple of days or something. Sometimes it was over a few months, where they sort of phased their way into it. Another way to approach this is from, who did this happen to? So it happened a lot to people who were suicidally depressed. You didn't have to be meditating. Some people, for whatever reason, when the razor blade is right at their wrist, it slices right. Most people, I think, it slices right on through and they bleed out or whatever. Some people, the razor blade is right at their wrist, and just when it's about to touch the skin, boom, PNSE.
Interesting.
And so I actually...
Now, wait a minute. We have to stop there, because that gets really... That first was too easy of a question about meaning. Let's get to the real meaning questions, and let's start with one of the wisdom traditions that you bumped into a lot, Buddhism. A couple of the claims of Buddhism are, one, reincarnation and karma. They're central to it, and they also get to this idea of a moral imperative, of a goodness, good versus evil, all these meaning questions that we want to pull apart. And we've looked at, on this show, the scientific evidence for reincarnation, which is quite strong, as you know. Ian Stevenson, University of Virginia, now followed up by Jim Tucker. I mean, Anyone who looks at that says, wow, it's really kind of hard to dismiss that. Reincarnation is true, seems to be true, evidentially strong. The idea of karma is supported by a number of different spiritual traditions, but is also supported by the near-death experience data. And come back and say there is this life review, and it's not imposed from the top down from a vengeful God, but is more imposed internally, a sense of I do have to do good, I do have... And also from the near-death experience research, there's a sense of choice, which is left out of your research or contradicts your research, where there is no choice. It's just this unfolding. In particular, there's a strong sense from the near-death experience literature of people having completed their life mission and can choose to go back or not go back. So I've thrown a couple of different things on the table there, but how do we sort out some of that information that seems to contradict some of your findings?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a dog in a lot of those fights, to use the vernacular. Like, for instance, Peter Fenwick's a friend of mine, and he's a big wheel in the near-death world, in the academic research into near-death and all of that. And we have great conversations about his stuff. We have great conversations about my stuff. We have interesting conversations about overlaps in terms of sometimes with sort of the post, especially like people who are way beyond location 4. There are interesting effects in terms of mind-matter interaction type things and stuff like that. There are similar things that show up in his research into near-death experiences and even the death and dying process itself, or what happens even after death. Lots of interesting data that he's collected around things like that, and so there are these overlaps.
But you don't feel a drive to harmonize that literature with your findings? You just want to kind of stick to your knitting kind of thing?
Yeah, no, I don't. No, I don't really feel. I mean, if it comes up in research interviews, if it comes up as a core part of the experience, then it's important to me. But if it doesn't come up as a core part of the experience, or it comes up as something, and when you're asking people about changes in cognition, affect, perception, and memory, near-death stuff isn't that likely to come up, unless that played some important role into why they pursued a shift into persistent non-symbolic experience or something like that, and it's part of their sort of overall narrative, and there's cognitive and emotional changes that they went through in relation to that. I mean, that's in there.
Yeah, I mean, my interest in that has always been the kind of ladder leaning against the wall, to use the analogy. I mean, if we now have the brain out of the picture, more or less, severely compromised, if you can't accept the term dead, which clinically it is dead, but you can't accept that, severely compromised, not functioning in a way that we could explain any kind of conscious experience, and yet we're having these emotions, we're having this cognition, we're having all the rest of this. I mean, it kind of challenges in a fundamental way what we're measuring when we measure these other things. And that's, I don't know. I think what you're doing is incredibly valuable, and the approach that you're taking to it, I think is wonderful. I mean, you're just, you have to stick to your knitting, right? I mean, you can't just be on this personal mission to kind of jump over here and there. You just have to kind of do the best you can in digging into your stuff, but that has to cross your mind. I mean, what does it mean for these people to be having these experiences without the brain? I mean,
sure. I mean, I've been interested in stuff like that. I mean, it's why I know people from the near-death community and all these other various communities. No doubt about that. But, in our data, our data is what our data is, basically. One of the things to keep in mind about persistent non-symbolic experience is that death doesn't really become that important. So, there isn't really a fear of death. It's not really weighing heavily on you. I don't find that people spend much time thinking about what's beyond death. Our data shows what the priorities of these individuals are and aren't. And death and what happens after death and, whatever else, it just, because there's no fear of death, those kinds of questions just don't rule your life like they do for twice-borns. I don't know if they rule their life necessarily for the once-borns that we were talking about earlier with William James.
Dr. Martin, what's your goal in this? I hear you talking about engaging video game makers and other culture makers, and I just scratch my head and go, really? Is that where we're going with this? Or you talk about, equally kind of hard for me to grasp, is you talk about engaging religious leaders, which, in what way? To kind of tell them they're wrong again? I mean, what is your goal in some of that culture making and culture war kind of stuff?
I think from our standpoint, we've got a lot of data around a very different sort of sense of self than is traditionally researched and is prevalent in society today. So a question for us is, how do we get that information out in meaningful ways that are able to significantly impact people's lives, because it does seem quite beneficial. I don't think you release something that produces a permanent shift in someone without releasing the undo button for it, right? I mean, we're not advocates that like everybody should want this and everybody should experience this, and we should just be enforced from on high, by the powers that be, or it should be, subliminally put into, media or whatever else. But it's certainly hard for anyone in our position, seeing the data that we've seen over these years, to say that it shouldn't be widely and more reliably available. So that there's two sides to that. The first is, I spent most of this research project with a technological bias, thinking, okay, well, we'll narrow down what's going on in the brain here probably, and then we'll use neurofeedback, neurostimulation techniques, and that'll be that. And finally, it won't be this crazy, messy process. With, you don't have to be suicidally depressed to get there. You don't have to try 40 years of meditation and die before, having never made it there. All of these kind of problems, if you really want to get to it. And interestingly, there are religious sects that actually do try to get you to suicidal depression, so in hopes that you'll wake up. I mean, there's stuff like that that's actually out there. We're not the first ones to pull that type of data together. So that's been our traditional view. And my view from that side of the world has been, right from very early days, that, no one sits in front of their screen and watches little bars go up and down for neurofeedback, right? Nobody wants to go to a clinic and strap something on their head for neurostimulation. These are things that ultimately would have to be productized in order to have a wide impact. And so if you ask yourself, okay, well, what is that? What does it look like in the future? We've got about another 5 years probably before the algorithms are in place for EEG to be able to really do what we'd like it to do, to get to these deep brain regions and do the things that we need. And if you look at that 5-year time arc, and you look at where Western culture is, 5 years from now, you're going to have photorealistic gameplay for video games. You're going to have much more deeply immersive experience. People like Palmer Luckey and others are going to have sort of really powerful VR technologies that they've released out there.
I hear you, but now it seems like this is the part I can't connect, is you're now venturing off into a totally different dimension that I can't help but see how it kind of contradicts this continuum that you surprisingly discovered, right? From, you don't want to put them as hierarchical, but location 1, location 2, location 3, location 4. It's this idea of less thinking, selflessness, all that kind of a good spiritual stuff that we normally attach that word, leads to less of an attachment, less of a clinging, less of a materialistic worry about how it's disseminated or who gets it or how good the virtual reality game is. There just seems to be a disconnect there a little bit to me between how we would productize it or how we would roll it out in technology with the basic finding, which is that none of that stuff matters. I mean, whatever does matter, maybe we can't say. But what your subjects seem to be coming back again and again is saying that stuff certainly doesn't matter. And the extent to which our society and our culture demands that we think that matters the most, aren't we moving in the wrong direction? Shouldn't we all just go with the nuns and the Zen and just
that's a really interesting point, because I think that we could talk about this probably in a whole. Could give it its own show. So you could make a part 2 out of this if you want to. That's fine. But there's a couple of things to say about that. First of all, I think a lot of what's been put around this type of thing is a lot of spiritual salesmanship. And so those types of notions, they're not necessarily borne out in terms of people's actual lives. But they are all over the place with people trying to sell the notion that you should pursue this. And I think that's fine. I used to have a lot of harsh judgment around that type of thing. It used to make me really angry that I would see these spiritual and religious leaders and stuff just knowing that they were lying. frankly, about what this produced and the experience that this produced. Like, they would talk about how, well, if you want an orange, you just hold out your hand and an orange manifests in your hand, right? Not so much. So there's all sorts of attempts that have been made to sell this, which I think goes to the other part of your question, and that is that you don't see a detachment around everyone who experiences this in terms of whether or not other people should adopt it. In fact, lots of times you see a tremendous passion come over these people, such to the extent that they are willing to be deceptive in their practices of, trying to pull people in, and they are willing to say, once you're in harmony with the universe, you'll just live forever. You'll never be ill, and yet they get old and die, right? Or you'll just be able to manifest. You just hold out your hand and whatever you want manifests. And okay, well, can you do that for me right now? While I have this video recording? Oh, well, no, can't do that. Right? And so it's just there's a lot of I can in a way I'm very sympathetic to them, where I would not have been sympathetic, or I would have been much more harshly judgmental of them earlier from a moral or a values-driven or whatever standpoint, because I see now that they have this thing that they know brings such tremendous relief to the suffering and average human life, and yet they can't get anybody to take an interest in doing it. And I was talking to sort of a major unity minister recently, and I was kind of posing this question to them, like, you basically have this spiritual framework. It's his particular spiritual church is very sort of non-dual, enlightenment sort of oriented. Unity is kind of a looser framework. You can have different churches with different ideologies and stuff, and so that's his. He's kind of well known in that world for being one of the main advocates of that. He's got a huge church, and even he was like, it's so, we have so much to give people, but man, having them allow us to actually give it to, it's like pulling teeth. And he's like, I spent 30, 40 years or whatever trying to think about how in the world do I get people to just open up and let us benefit them. And it's like they just refuse to. It's just like impossible to get people to do that. And so from unity ministers to religious gurus to, whoever, I think there's this kind of baffling thing where from your side of the fence you realize, oh man, this torture that is your life, that could go, nothing can change in your life, but the torture can lift, right? I mean, you can still be going bankrupt, your wife can still be leaving you, your kids could still have died, but you don't need to suffer in this extreme anguish way that you're doing now. There's a whole other way that all of that can show up for you. Not that you won't be sad about your son dying or whatever. And so, I think that there's a lot that's driven that, and a lot of the spiritual salesmanship comes from that, and it's become hard for me to sort of assign the same level of blame and harsh judgment and whatnot on those people, especially as I've got to know them. I've gotten to know the people that are in the circles around them. I've seen how they evolved over time from initially trying to be just, very straightforward about it, but not being able to impact anybody, to having to compete with materialist culture and kind of do it on its terms in terms of the promises that you're making and things like that. So I think all of that is difficult to separate out from people's ideologies and belief systems and stuff now in the public around things like persistent non-symbolic experience. There's all these beliefs around what it is, and it's all this combination of a lot of, frankly, ridiculous spiritual salesmanship claims. And it's not really what it is. It's in many ways just a very subtle shift.
Yeah, I hear you. I keep coming back to, though, I totally accept that might be true. I do feel a need to harmonize some of the things I'm talking about. The reincarnation research, how does that really fit in? Mediumistic communication research, some really solid stuff there as well as the near-death experience research. But maybe that is best left for part 2. So tell folks, Dr. Martin, where they can find out more about this amazing, amazing body of research that you have.
Sure. We have a ugly academic website called nonsymbolic.org. Not as ugly as many, it's not the version that we made in Notepad years ago, like so many others do in our world. It's a little bit prettier now, and actually has a WordPress backend and all of that. But nonetheless, don't expect any sort of stunning beauty or anything when you go there. And we also have. We have a mailing list on there for public people. We have a mailing list on there for researchers. And we have a mailing list on there for participants. We actually don't really mail much to the researcher and the participant mailing lists. That's more a way for you to let us know if you're a researcher who's interested in the space. You sign up on that, and now we know about you and that kind of thing. And if you want to be a participant in research, it's not just our research. We make our participant pool available to really anybody in the space who's got a good, solid, real, legitimate research project that they want to do. And so periodically we'll take sort of people that are on that list and we'll bring in some fresh blood, if you will, into our existing pool. For our research, we've mostly stuck with around 1,200 people for many, many years now. Right, in terms of the center's internal research, but we support a lot of other projects and graduate students and things like that all over the world. And so people who experience non-symbolic experience or think that they're experiencing non-symbolic experience can sign up for that list. And then this year we've done something that's really, I think, quite remarkable. It's maybe the most remarkable thing to me out of all of this. Especially as someone who spent so many years focused on technological solutions, focused on the fact that this was probably heading towards an integration of neurofeedback and VR and video games and stuff like that in terms of how people can more reliably access it. And that is once we realized that we really had this 5-year technology gap, we went back last year and we started to look at all of the different methods that were mentioned by people. We have this sort of form that you fill out at the beginning of the research which asks about your background and stuff like that. And there was a section on there that we hadn't really paid that much attention to. And it was around your practices that you did. So, a certain percentage of the population, obviously they were in a religious tradition or a spiritual tradition. They were actually actively trying to get there, right? And so we asked them what they did and what they felt worked. And we went back and coded that actually not all that long ago. And we'd never done it before because we were interested in the technology side of it, not so much the traditional method side of it. And when we coded it, it was really kind of interesting. Only a handful of methodological categories of practice really rose to the top of that list, which was quite fascinating and the second thing that was really interesting is that there was clearly an effect that emerged in the data for you being matched up to one or more methods. So, nobody had more than 3 methods, for instance, that they matched up to out of that handful of methods. And most people, it was just like 1 or 2 things.
So a method would be like a certain kind of meditation or a certain practice along those lines.
Exactly. And so what was fascinating about that to us was that we realized that people basically have the deck stacked against them, which we didn't know before. We were interested in getting our arms around this process, describing this process, or describing the what persistent non-symbolic experience is, etc. But we really hadn't looked that much beyond broad categories of suicide or religious practice or whatever in terms of how people got there. However, what emerged from this is that like if you're really trying for this, you seem to kind of have the deck stacked against you. So there's this certain number of techniques that appear to be the ones that really work well. But even within them, they only work for a small percentage of people, each one of them, right? And so you not only have to if you go out and you decide, I want to meditate, I want to learn to meditate, right? So you search Google and there's 100 million results in Google. And there's thousands of different styles of stuff that everybody's saying, oh, this works. This is the one that works. You need to use this one because it's the one that works, right? You're kind of screwed if you're doing that search, at least from our data's perspective, because it looked like there were just these handful of things that really sort of rose to the top. And then not only did that, but if you had 4 of them and you didn't have, a 5th one, and that was the one that wound up working for you, then you would have never made any progress. And so there's all this complexity there. So we started experimenting around with this, and we thought, well, the only thing we can really do is just start having people do this. So we did it initially internally. And we wound up coming up with what seems to be a very well-crafted protocol, with putting things in certain orders, and there's only about a half a dozen of these categories, and so we had to figure out how long you had to practice each one before you knew if it was good for you or not, and how you could tell if it was good for you or not, and all that kind of thing. And then some of them produce dark nights, and others of them don't, and so we had to figure out, okay, well, how do you get around the dark night problem, because you don't want to be telling people methods. At least if you're in our shoes as academics, you don't want to be telling people a list of methods and have a couple of them spin them out into bad psychology states for years, right? And so we had a lot of problems like that to solve. But earlier this year, last year, we kind of thought like we nailed it. This is, as we're doing this interview, it's the end of 2014. And so earlier this year, we put out to the Fourth Awakening email list and stuff like that. We basically put out an offer for a pilot study. And we had 6 people. 6 people respond to it. Well, we had a lot of people respond to it, but then we whittled it down to about 30 people, and we had them take a bunch of academic measures, and then we picked 6 people because we weren't sure if people were going to go crazy, or we had to follow very ethical research practices to make sure that we could support the number of people, even in a worst-case scenario, all that. To our surprise, 5 people of those people successfully completed that training all the way through. The 6th person was in South Africa, and there were communications issues, and Google Hangouts just doesn't work that well across country boundaries and stuff. We were doing the instruction live on Google Hangouts every week. So the 6th person kind of had the deck stacked against him, unfortunately. But the other 5 people, they did it. They made it all the way through, and we were quite amazed. But they all transitioned, it seemed, to an ongoing non-symbolic experience. So our academic definition, persistent non-symbolic experience, is people who have experienced it for over a year. Ongoing non-symbolic experiences is people who have experienced it for less than a year, but in a consistent and unbroken way since, since it first happened to them or whatever. But it hasn't been a year yet, basically, right? And then a temporary non-symbolic experience is, you're in it for a week or a month or a day or a moment or whatever, and then you fall back out of it. We gave those people also a huge amount of psychological measures on well-being, depression, anxiety, mystical stuff, you name it. And they've just rocked those measures before and after as well. And so that was very exciting to us because really for the first time, our entire project, if you think about it, has had a very significant data limitation. And that is, it was always post-PNSE data collection. We never met anybody who, there was one participant that I knew 20 years ago, who I had some frame of reference for who he was then and who he is now, but that was it. And out of 1,200 people, it's like not big, not useful, right? That's not very meaningful. Anecdotally a little bit, but not much. So now we're in a phase of the research where it's just remarkable because we're able to basically take people and perform measurements on them and then put them through a protocol and have a certain percentage of them transition to different locations. Out of that first group, there was somebody at the end of location 1. Most people were in location 2. One person was in location 3, and one person was on the fringe of location 4 that came out of it. And so it wasn't even like this protocol is just neatly putting people into a certain bin or something. And we got a great amount of diverse data from there. So we ran another one a little bit later on in the year and took in 60 people this time. Kept them in groups of 6, kept the format as much as we could the same. I'd recorded the videos for the first group to make my life easier so that they could watch the videos back instead of asking a lot of questions. And so I just reused those videos basically from that first group, which allowed it to be a pretty uniform experiment. And we had a mentored group, and we had a couple of mentored groups. They were mentored by successful people from the first one. So they were more live-y, not all recorded. And then we had 8 groups that were all just using the recorded stuff. And out of that, we had 70% of people transition to some sort of location of ongoing non-symbolic experience at the end of it. Same thing, huge changes across the academic measures and all of that stuff. And so now we're running a third one.
the results were so good from that, it just felt like ethically we couldn't not do it again, even though it's ridiculously time-consuming and it kind of sucks the air out of everything else that I'm doing. And we have a great team, and they're able to keep the balls moving forward and stuff. So we just kind of thought, okay, well, we should do this again. And I think probably by the time we've run it 4 times, we'll be through it with enough statistical power, that we'll be able to really do some interesting number crunching on that. So 45 people or 43 people wound up finishing the second one of the 60 that came in. Nobody dropped out of the mentored groups, so all of the dropouts were from the unmentored groups. And so this is a really, I think, exciting period in the sense that for the first time ever in the research, that's why we really wanted the technological innovations, right, was to be able to do A-B data and not just B data, because forever all we have is B data. But I know the cognitive biases that are associated with this and whatnot, and so they're obviously going to color everything that's self-reported in A data, right? And trying to imagine your A data and what your A data would have been, right? And so this is a new sort of thing that's come during this period of time, and it's exciting. So people can participate in that experiment if they want to. It's not free. We fund it basically by charging people to go through it. But they can check it out at Finder's Course if they want to. I think the fourth one, which may very well be the last one, depends on when we get our statistical power and whether or not we can automate it enough so it doesn't take 10 hours of my day every day. It starts in January 10th, I think, or something like that. Let me answer one other thing for you real quick, because it comes from the Finder's Course stuff, and it loops back around to your earlier question.
There isn't a lot of change that happens with morality around this. And as you know from just the short descriptions earlier, sitting down with religious leaders and stuff, oftentimes they were more dogmatic than... it seemed like the process of transitioning to persistent non-symbolic experience within a religious tradition, kind of cemented in their belief and their dogmatism around that tradition and such. I do think that outfits like Buddhism, or traditions, religions, whatever we want to call it, like Buddhism and others, and really all of them, probably recognized a long time ago that this didn't produce a shift in morality, and that it could sort of lock in belief system and ideology as a function of the shift, and they started putting in that type of stress and training and importance. So I think moral education does become important, that type of thing. So anyway, one of the things that I was nervous about, and in fact, I was in Boulder for the first time in like 20 years. I hadn't made it to Boulder. I just travel all over the world, I haven't made it back to Boulder. But I was in Boulder, and so I thought, while I'm in Boulder, I want to see Ken Wilber. I've been a long time. And so I stopped by his loft, and I had this conversation with him about this, where I said, it seems like in all of our data, the thing that I'm most worried about, if we actually do have a protocol that is successfully able to produce this shift, and if we're increasingly successful at getting technology to more reliably do it and whatever else, I'm really sort of concerned about sort of this dogmatism, this locking in of ideology, and this sort of rigidness that I've seen in a lot of the data that I've collected. And he had a lot of those same concerns. And so he'd done a lot, of course, with his integral work, trying to figure out ways around that, because he sort of recognized it as a significant issue as well. And it's interesting because it's now, I don't know, half a year, 8 months, or however long later, 10 months maybe later, and my view on that has completely changed. I'm really not worried about that. And I'm not worried about that because I, for the first time ever, been able to see people who wanted to have this experience and who wanted to shift into this experience both before and after the experience. And I've been able to see that it doesn't, that they don't have these intensely negative sort of dogmatic shifts, and that, they're really wonderful and delightful people. Some of them do isolate. Some of them, have, one of the people from the very first group has kind of isolated herself and fallen out of touch with the group, as an example. And so that certainly does happen. But generally speaking, I mean, people they're so lovely after this experience. And so, I just want to touch on that a little bit, because I think people will probably hear earlier interviews with me and things like that where I've mentioned my concerns around that, and that was true up to even just half a year or a few months ago. And now that's been a big change. So I think even in this regard, we see this as sort of something that's positive and beneficial to roll out.
Great. Well, I think a lot of people will find it positive and beneficial as well. It's a great body of research, fascinating. I do hope people will check it out. Again, we'll have links, of course, in the show notes to the book, The Fourth Awakening, and to the website where you can actually maybe even join this research and become a participant. How exciting. So Dr. Jeffery Martin has been our guest. Fascinating to have you on. Thanks again so much for joining me.
Thank you, Alex. This was great. I know so many people have been looking forward to our chat. I'm glad we could finally get it in for them.
Thanks again to Dr. Jeffery Martin for joining me on Skeptiko. I have a couple of questions to tee up as a result of this interview, but I do want to tell you that this is the first interview where I've done this kind of Skeptiko 3.0 thing where I've previewed this interview with some of the listeners on the Skeptiko forum. And just to let you know, if you'd like to be on the preview list to hear the interview before it's published, then go over to my Facebook page and either friend me or like the page and send me a note through Facebook telling me that you'd like to be on the preview list. And then I'll send you a preview of the show before it comes out so you can get in to some of these questions. Otherwise, it's just going to come out all polished and clean at the end like this one did, and then you can join in the discussion there too. So on this one, I did preview it with some listeners and got some interesting feedback. And I want to roll that into some questions. One question based on that feedback centers around this idea of spiritual salesmanship. And I guess that cuts a couple of ways. Dr. Martin in the show talks about spiritual salesmanship being a lot of the window dressing that's behind some of the teachers that we associate with meditation and enlightenment. And I think he's trying to distill down the essence of what they're really teaching and stripping away the spiritual salesmanship. What do you think about that? And I guess the flip side of that is some of the pushback I got towards Dr. Martin was that here's a guy who's trying to develop a course and he's selling the course, and the course is kind of pricey. It's about $1,500 and it takes a long time and a lot of effort. And some folks saw his efforts as being spiritual salesmanship. So what do you think about that? And what do you think about courses like this being out there for a fee, and what should that fee be, and how do people access it? Now, let me just add one comment to that. My thought on that is I get where people are coming from. They'd like to see this made available to more people at a lower price. They kind of shy away at any thought of someone making any money or making any money even in the future. I don't think Dr. Martin's making a heck of a lot of money on this right now. I tell you, given the hours that he has to spend, I don't think it's not like a really good economic deal at this point. That's not to say that it couldn't be at some other point. But I step back and I go, who the heck is doing this research? So I might not agree with all his conclusions. I might not agree with where he's going with it in terms of putting it in games or enmeshing it into the culture. And I'm not sure he's leaning his ladder against the right wall, as I said in the show. But I'll tell you what, we sure as heck need more people out there doing this kind of research and applying the rigor and the proper methods that he's trying to apply towards doing it. So I can do nothing than applaud and cheer him on and hope that he'll add to this mix, and we can then pick out of that the pieces that we want and the information that will help us decide whatever we're going to decide about what we should do about enlightenment, how we should get enlightened, and all the rest. So a couple of questions there mixed in with a little bit of my comment. But I'd like to get your comments on that. Place to do that, of course, is through the Skeptiko website, which you'll find at skeptiko.com. I've been going through all sorts of problems with my search engine optimization for the site. It's been completely invisible for months and months through Google search. All my problem, nothing nefarious there, just things got messed up, and I'm trying to get those better. So, hey, along those lines, if you can, go search for Skeptiko, find it do a couple of extra searches in Google and click through to skeptiko.com so we can get that re-linked up on Google, if you will. So from the Skeptiko website, you can join the discussion through the Skeptiko forum. You can comment right there on the website. You can go over to the YouTube channel, Facebook, Twitter, follow me on Twitter, friend me up on Facebook or whatever you want to do. But I want to connect with you. I'd love to connect with you. I've been doing more and more interviews for Why Science is Wrong. I got a bunch more of those scheduled. I love doing those interviews because I love connecting with different people who have different views, who don't necessarily agree with me, are coming at things from a different perspective. And if you're out there and you have those kind of different views, I'd love to hear from you. I get a little overwhelmed with people and contacts and stuff, so I'm not always super on top of responding right away, but I really do enjoy it. And that's the reason I do this show, is to connect with different people and get a lot of different ideas flowing. I really enjoy that. So please do reach out and connect with me. I'd love to hear from you. Now, I have a number of really interesting interviews coming up. I've really gone out there and reached out to the atheist community, the skeptical community, and it's working. I have some big name interviews. Michael Shermer's coming up. Dr. Lawrence Krauss from The Unbelievers is coming up, and then a couple more. I just have a lot of interviews. I'm going to have to try and speed up the pace of getting these out because I love doing the interviews. I just don't always like cranking them out and the work that's involved. If you're interested in helping me, production assistant, or assisting in some other way, let me know, so maybe we can figure out a way to get these things out faster. But that's it. I've gone on for quite a while here after the interview, much more than normal. So let me wrap it up by again thanking you all for listening and for making this Skeptiko experience so much fun for me. I hope you're enjoying it. Take care, and bye for now.